Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now we begin. I often wonder if it's all in my head, if the creeping dread I feel is just a product of my imagination. But then I hear it, the sound that always follows me, no matter where I go, no matter how far I run. It's subtle at first, like the faintest whisper on the wind. Then it becomes more pronounced, more real, until it's impossible to ignore. A shadow, a presence. Something watching me from behind. I live in an old house tucked away on the outskirts of town, where the streets are quiet, the air thick with the smell of wet earth and damp wood. It's the kind of place where the walls creak with the weight of history, where every corner seems to hold a secret, and the rooms seem to shift when you're not looking. Sometimes in the dead of night, I hear footsteps in the hall, or the soft rustle of fabric against the floor. But when I open the door, no one's there. No one except for me. The house belonged to my grandfather, a man I never truly understood. There were rumors, whispers about the things he did, the places he went. He was a man of few words, but when he spoke, it was always in riddles, always about the past and the things he had seen. Things he was trying to forget, but never could. And now, after his death, I've inherited the house. Inherited the memories, too. I didn't want to come here. I didn't want to be trapped in this place, haunted by the weight of history, by the whispers of things that were never meant to be remembered. But here I am, trying to make sense of it all. Trying to ignore the feeling that something is here with me. It starts with the small things. The flicker of the lights. The strange, offbeat creaking of the floorboards. The cold spots in the corners of rooms, even in the dead heat of summer. They say old houses settle, that it's nothing to worry about, but I can't shake the feeling that it's more than that. Sometimes when I'm alone in my room, I hear breathing. Soft and steady, like someone is standing just outside the door, waiting for me to open it. But when I do, the hallway is always empty. I've tried to ignore it, telling myself it's just the house, just the wind, just my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I know it's something else. Something that doesn't belong. Something that's been here long before I arrived. The first real sign that something was wrong came one evening, just as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The house was bathed in a golden light, the kind that makes everything look peaceful, calm, almost serene. I had just finished unpacking some old boxes in the attic, my grandfather's belongings, things I'd never seen before. Old photos, yellowed letters, strange trinkets that seemed to have no place in this world. I was sitting by the window, gazing out at the fading light when I heard it. A soft rustle, like fabric brushing against wood. I turned, my heart skipping a beat, but there was nothing. The room was empty. Still, I convinced myself it was just the wind again, or maybe the house settling, but the feeling in the air had changed. The room seemed heavier somehow, like it was holding its breath. The silence was thick, pressing in on me, suffocating. I stood, my legs unsteady, and walked to the door. As I reached for the handle, I felt it cold, like a shadow had passed through me. I froze, my hand gripping the door frame, my pulse quickening. And then I heard it again. A soft, barely audible whisper, as though someone were speaking just beyond my hearing, too faint for words but heavy with intent. The whisper seemed to swirl around me like smoke, making my skin crawl. Come closer. I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to get out of that room. I had to leave. But the door wouldn't open. I pulled harder, panic rising in my throat, but it was as if something was holding it shut from the other side. A presence pressing against the door, keeping me trapped in the room. My breath came in ragged gasps as I turned to the window, trying to think of another way out. That's when I saw it. A shadow. It was small at first, just a flicker in the corner of my eye, but then it grew slowly, stretching across the floor like something alive. It moved, shifting with a purpose, not like any natural shadow I'd ever seen. And then I saw it. The shape. A figure. But not quite a figure. Something else. Something that didn't belong in this world. It was tall, taller than any person should be, its edges blurring and flickering like the flames of a dying fire. I could see the outline of arms, legs, distorted, elongated, moving in ways that defied the laws of nature. And those eyes, those terrible, empty eyes, locked onto mine, piercing through the space between us. I wanted to scream, but no sound came. My voice was trapped in my throat, suffocated by the weight of fear. The shadow seemed to stretch toward me, its presence swallowing the air, its coldness wrapping around my chest like a vice. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. The room was silent again. The door opened easily this time, as if nothing had ever been there to stop me. The shadow, the whispers, everything, it was gone. But the feeling of its presence lingered. It wasn't gone. It couldn't be. And that's when I realized something terrible. The shadow never left. It's been here all along, waiting for the right moment to remind me that I cannot escape it. That it will always be with me. I couldn't sleep that night. The hours seemed to stretch on endlessly, each tick of the clock a loud reminder of my isolation. The bed, which had once been a place of comfort, now felt like a trap. The shadows in the corners of my room twisted and turned, stretching in impossible angles, as if they had lives of their own. No matter how many times I blinked or rubbed my eyes, they remained, those distorted shapes lurking just beyond my reach. I tried to convince myself that it was just the dark playing tricks on me, that I was imagining things. But deep down I knew better. I knew what I had seen. I knew that whatever had been in that room with me, whatever had watched me with those unblinking eyes, was still here. It hadn't left. I thought about my grandfather. He had always warned me about the house, about the history that came with it. He'd never been very specific, but there was always a certain weight in his voice when he spoke about the place. A hint of something he couldn't or wouldn't say. I remember the way his hands would shake when he mentioned the old attic or the door at the back of the cellar. He always told me to avoid them, that some things were better left undisturbed. But I hadn't listened. I thought I could handle it. I thought it was all just stories, just his way of scaring me, keeping me from exploring. But now I wasn't so sure. I needed answers. I needed to understand what was happening, what I had seen. Maybe there was something in the house, something in the walls that had triggered this presence. Maybe it was tied to the land itself, to something older than the house, something buried beneath its floorboards. I stood up, feeling the cold air settle over me like a heavy blanket. The night was still, almost suffocatingly so. No sound of crickets outside, no rustle of wind through the trees. Just the silence, thick and oppressive. I had to go back there. I had to see if there was something I had missed, something I hadn't noticed before. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way up the narrow staircase. The wood creaked beneath my feet, echoing through the empty house. Each step seemed louder than the last, as though the house itself was warning me to turn back. But I couldn't. I wouldn't. The door to the attic was slightly ajar, just as it had been before. I pushed it open, and a wave of stale air hit me. The room smelled musty, like dust and old paper, the smell of forgotten things. My flashlight flickered as I stepped inside, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The floor was littered with boxes, old trunks and crates, my grandfather's belongings, the things he had left behind. I began to sift through them, pulling open boxes filled with old photographs, letters, and strange trinkets. But as I dug deeper, I found something that caught my eye, something I hadn't noticed before. It was a small, leather-bound journal, worn at the edges, its pages yellowed with age. There was no name on the cover, no markings to indicate its owner. I opened it slowly, my hands trembling. The handwriting inside was messy, frantic, as though the writer was in a hurry to get something down before it was too late. The words were fragmented, half-sentences, a jumble of thoughts and observations. But the more I read, the clearer it became. The entries were dated, spanning years, decades even, and they all seemed to be about the same thing, the shadow. At first, the writer spoke of it as if it were a metaphor, something he couldn't explain but felt nonetheless. But as the entries went on, the tone shifted. The shadow became more real, more tangible. It wasn't just a feeling anymore, it was something he could see, something that followed him just like it followed me. The final entry, written in a hurried, almost panicked scrawl, sent a chill down my spine. It's here again. I can feel it. It's waiting for me. I don't know how much longer I have. The page was torn as though someone had ripped it out in haste. But I didn't need to read any more. I knew what it meant. I wasn't alone in this house. The shadow wasn't just mine. It had been here before, and it had never left. I felt a coldness seep into the room, the temperature dropping rapidly, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. The shadow was close. I could feel it lurking just outside the beam of my flashlight. And then I heard it. A faint whisper like the rustling of leaves in the wind. At first it was so quiet I thought I had imagined it. But then it grew louder, more distinct, until it was clear. I've been waiting for you. My heart raced. The flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into darkness. I fumbled for the switch, my hands shaking. The whispering grew louder, the air thick with the weight of something ancient, something malevolent. I could feel it closing in on me, pressing in from all sides. The walls seemed to move, the room shifting, warping, as though the very fabric of reality was beginning to tear apart. I turned, desperate to escape, but the stairs seemed to stretch farther away, the door to the hallway too far out of reach. The whispering grew louder, surrounding me, until it was all I could hear, all I could feel. You can't run from me. You never could. I spun around, my eyes straining in the darkness, but there was nothing. Just the same empty attic, the same cluttered boxes. But then I saw it. The shadow. It was there, standing in the corner of the room, its form shifting, flickering like smoke. It was tall, impossibly tall, its features obscured by the darkness. But I could feel its eyes, those eyes staring at me, piercing through the blackness. I backed away, but my feet caught on something, sending me sprawling to the floor. My breath came in ragged gasps as I scrambled to my feet, but the shadow didn't move. It didn't need to. I knew then that it wasn't just following me, it had been waiting for me all along. And now there was no escape. The air in the attic felt suffocating, thick with an unnatural cold that clung to my skin like ice. My breath, shallow and panicked, echoed in the silence as I scrambled to stand, my hands shaking violently. The shadow. It was still there. I could feel it like an oppressive weight pressing in on all sides, suffocating me in its unseen grip. I forced myself to look up, my eyes squinting through the darkness, hoping for a glimpse of something that would tell me this was just a nightmare. But the shadow remained, an inky blackness in the corner, shifting and flickering as though it were alive, no, more than alive. It was waiting, and the thought sent a ripple of terror through my chest. I tried to move, but my feet felt as if they were glued to the floor. The instinct to flee screamed in my mind, but my body refused to obey. Something about the presence in the room paralyzed me. Every movement felt sluggish, heavy, as if the shadow was feeding on my fear, growing stronger with every moment of hesitation. The whispering grew louder again, filling the attic with its cold, breathless voice. It was no longer just words, it was a presence, a weight that I could feel pressing on my very soul. You can't hide. You can't run from me. I've always been here. The voice was distant, yet impossibly close, as though it surrounded me from every direction. I turned my head frantically, my flashlight now completely dead, its beam long gone. I was left in pure darkness, and that whisper, that voice, was the only thing that remained. I backed away from the corner where the shadow stood, my hands trembling, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't think straight. My mind was racing, but all I could focus on was the coldness, the sense of something ancient and malicious closing in on me, swallowing everything around me. Then something shifted. A shape moved in the corner of my vision, a flicker of movement, a subtle distortion in the air. I froze, my body frozen in place as I slowly turned to face it. There, just beyond the reach of my fading vision, I saw something else. Not the shadow anymore, but something more. Real. It was a figure, tall, thin, its form indistinct, like smoke or mist, but somehow. Wrong. Its body shifted unnaturally, as though it were made of shadow and light all at once. Its features were blurred, the face too distorted to comprehend, but I could feel its gaze. It was staring at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. It was like the air had thickened, turned to cement, and I was stuck, a prisoner in my own skin. My thoughts scrambled, fighting against the panic, trying to cling to the tiniest thread of reason. But all I could think about was the feeling, the overwhelming certainty that this thing knew me. It wanted me. The whispers turned to laughter, low, guttural, twisted laughter that reverberated in my bones. I covered my ears, but it was pointless. The laughter wasn't in my ears, it was inside my head. It knew my thoughts. So afraid, so fragile, you can't hide from me. My legs finally gave out beneath me, sending me crashing to the floor. I couldn't stop shaking, couldn't stop the tears that spilled down my face. I wanted to scream, but my throat was tight, constricted by some invisible force. My vision blurred, my mind hazy with fear. What was it? What was this thing? The shadow in the corner of the room flickered again, and the figure seemed to step forward, its form stretching toward me in an unholy fluid motion. The air grew colder, the temperature plummeting, and I could see my breath now, coming in sharp, panicked gasps. It was coming closer. I had to move. I had to do something. Without thinking, I reached for the nearest object, a rusted old trunk that sat forgotten in the corner. My fingers closed around the heavy lid, but as I tried to lift it, something heavy pressed down on my chest, as if the very air itself was trying to keep me down, to keep me in place. I looked back up, hoping for an escape, but the figure was right in front of me now, so close that I could feel the heat of its presence. Its form shimmered in and out of focus like a mirage, but the sensation of it, the presence of it, was undeniable. My heart thundered in my chest as it reached for me, its long, spindly fingers brushing against my skin. It was ice cold. A jolt of fear shot through me, and I forced my body into motion. I shoved the trunk aside and scrambled to my feet, my heart racing, my mind a blur of panic. I could feel the floor beneath me shifting, the walls distorting, the space itself bending in on me. I had to get out of here. I stumbled toward the door, my hands shaking as I fumbled for the handle. The sound of footsteps echoed in the darkness, slow, deliberate, growing closer and closer, until I could feel the presence at my back, the cold breath of the shadow on my neck. Just as my hand closed around the door handle, I felt something grip my shoulder, sharp and unyielding. I spun around, my pulse roaring in my ears, and for a moment I saw it, the face. Or at least what could be called a face. It was featureless, save for two glowing, pale eyes that stared at me with an intensity that burned into my very soul. Its mouth stretched wide in a twisted grin, a grin that wasn't just unsettling, it was pure malice. The shadow seemed to pulse with hunger, an insatiable need, as though it was feeding on my fear. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. I was frozen, my body unable to move, unable to escape. You are mine now. The voice was everywhere. Inside my head, in my bones. It was a promise, a curse, a truth I couldn't deny. And then the world went black. I woke up with a start, gasping for air. My body jerked upright, my heart racing, my skin damp with cold sweat. I was no longer in the attic. The thick, suffocating darkness had been replaced with the familiar glow of the dim lamp on my bedside table. The room was silent. Too silent. I swallowed hard, trying to clear the fog from my mind. My pulse hammered in my ears, and I couldn't shake the lingering sensation that something was wrong. Had it been a dream? I reached up to touch my face, feeling the coldness of my skin, the tremble in my hands. The shadow, the figure. That feeling like something was just waiting, watching from the darkness, pressing in on me. It hadn't been a dream. I knew it hadn't been. I looked around my room, my eyes darting nervously to every corner. Nothing. The walls were the same as they had been before, ordinary, safe even. But I could feel it. That oppressive weight that had clung to me in the attic, it was here now. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, but my gaze kept flicking back to the corner by the door. My mind screamed at me to move, to get out of this room, but my body was frozen. I wanted to close my eyes, to shut it all out, but I couldn't. Not now. The whispers had returned. Soft at first, but slowly growing louder. I clutched my blankets, my knuckles white from the pressure, my body trembling as I strained to hear. Was I imagining it? No, the voice was real. It was coming from the shadows again. It was never just a dream. I froze. It was as if the voice had crawled into my skull, curling around my thoughts and whispering directly into my mind. My breathing hitched, and for a moment I thought I might lose control. Where was it coming from? Suddenly the room felt colder, a chill that seeped through my clothes, freezing my bones. I looked around, my breath shallow and ragged. I had to escape. I had to get out. But every time I tried to move, I found myself rooted to the spot, unable to lift even a finger. And then I saw it. A shadow, at the edge of my vision. It wasn't the same as before. It was bigger, stretching unnaturally across the wall, its form contorting and shifting like liquid darkness. It wasn't just a shadow, it was an entity. A living, breathing thing that knew me, that wanted me. I wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. My chest tightened and my throat felt constricted, as though the air around me had turned to cement. I couldn't breathe. The shadow was growing, the darkness filling the room, crawling towards me in a slow, methodical way. You can never escape. The voice was sharper now, more distinct, and it filled every corner of the room, vibrating in the air like a terrible hum. It wasn't just an idea anymore, it was something tangible. Something real. I turned to the side, my eyes wide with terror, and there, standing at the foot of my bed, was the figure. It was the same as before. Tall, thin, shrouded in a cloak of darkness that shifted and shimmered like smoke. Its features remained indistinct, blurry, yet those eyes, those piercing, hollow eyes, stared directly at me, boring into my soul. My body trembled uncontrollably as it took another step forward, its movements fluid, almost like it was gliding across the floor. It didn't make a sound, but I could feel its presence in the air. It wasn't just a figure, it was a nightmare made flesh. And it was here. I know you. I know your fears. I know everything about you. The words reverberated through my skull, twisting into something unrecognizable. It felt like my thoughts were being pulled apart, unraveling at the seams, like I was losing my grip on reality. It was inside my head now, whispering things I couldn't understand, but I could feel the weight of them, the gravity of the truths it spoke. I tried to scream again, but the sound stuck in my throat, suffocating me. The figure tilted its head, studying me, its grin widening. The darkness around it seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with each of its movements, filling the room with an unbearable sense of dread. It moved closer, closer still. My mind screamed at me to move, to run, but my body refused. I was paralyzed, frozen under its gaze. The coldness deepened, spreading like ice through my veins. My pulse pounded in my ears, each beat a drum of panic. It was right in front of me now. The shadow's cold fingers brushed against my face, a sharp, biting chill that made my skin crawl. I felt it. Its presence was inside me, like it was trying to break me, to rip apart everything I knew. It wasn't just a shadow. It was something far worse. Something ancient and unforgiving. Well, you can't fight me. The voice was harsh now, almost guttural, like a growl. I felt my stomach twist, my throat tighten with fear. I wanted to scream, but the words never came. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure stepped back. I gasped, my lungs seizing as I finally drew a breath. The room returned to normal, almost. But the figure was still there, lingering at the edges of my perception, like a shadow that never quite left. I looked around the room again, frantic, my heart pounding in my chest, and that's when I saw it. A small piece of paper, folded neatly on my bedside table. I didn't remember putting it there. I hadn't seen it before. But there it was, waiting for me. With shaking hands, I picked it up and opened it, my eyes scanning the words. You can't run. You can't hide. The past will find you. I felt my blood run cold. I knew these words. They were the same words that had haunted me for years. The same words from the letters I'd burned. The shadow had found me. And it wasn't letting go. I couldn't breathe. The letter crinkled in my trembling hands as I stared at the words, feeling their weight press against my chest. The darkness in the room seemed to deepen with every passing second, as though the very walls were closing in on me. I hadn't heard a sound, but I could feel it, the relentless presence that still lingered in the room. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was alive. My thoughts were racing, a blur of panic and disbelief. The past will find you. Those words. The letter had come from nowhere, as though it had materialized from thin air. I hadn't seen anyone, hadn't heard a door open or close. It was as if the universe had simply folded in on itself and handed me that message, like an omen, a curse I could never outrun. I took a shaky step back, my gaze darting toward the door. Could I escape? Should I try? But my legs felt as if they were made of stone. I stood there frozen, a prisoner in my own home. The darkness pressed in tighter, like it was aware of my every movement. The air itself felt heavy, charged with something that wasn't quite right. I reached for the light switch, my hand brushing against the wall, but as I flicked the switch, nothing. The light flickered for a split second, then died completely, plunging me into the thick, suffocating darkness once more. It wasn't the light bulb. It was something else. I could hear it now, soft, barely perceptible, but unmistakable. The sound of something scraping against the floor. Slow, measured, like someone was moving just out of my line of sight. My breath hitched in my throat. I turned toward the sound, my pulse spiking with each passing second. But there was nothing, just the heavy silence. The whisper came again, but this time it wasn't in my head. It was real, coming from the corner of the room. The voice was low, almost guttural, as if it were clawing its way out of the dark. I never left. My body stiffened, a wave of cold dread flooding over me. My eyes flicked to the corner, and there, standing in the shadows, was the figure. The same tall, dark shape that had haunted my every thought. But this time, it wasn't just a figment of my imagination. It was real. The air seemed to bend around it, as though reality itself was warping in its presence. I wanted to scream, but my voice had abandoned me. I could barely move my feet like lead. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body refused. The figure stepped forward, its presence more oppressive than ever before. I could feel its coldness seeping into my skin, into my bones. It was closer now, so close that I could almost make out its features, though they still eluded me, like smoke twisting and shifting just beyond my grasp. "You can't escape me," the voice rasped, closer now, almost in my ear. "I'm always here, always watching." The darkness around the figure seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting like a living thing. I could feel the weight of it pressing down on me, choking me, suffocating me. The room was no longer just a room. It was a prison, a cage. I needed to get out. I forced my legs to move, despite the overwhelming fear paralyzing me. I stumbled toward the door, my hands shaking uncontrollably as I fumbled for the handle. But as I grabbed it, a voice stopped me cold. "You can't outrun me." I froze, my hand still on the doorknob, my pulse hammering in my chest. I didn't need to turn around to know that it was right there. I could feel it. I could feel its presence creeping into my skin, into my very soul. It was always here, watching, waiting. It was no longer just a shadow. It was everything. I let go of the doorknob, my fingers trembling as I turned around slowly. It had stepped even closer, so close now that I could feel its cold breath on my skin. The darkness around it swirled like smoke, its form shifting and flickering, never quite fully materializing, yet always there. Always watching. "Why are you running?" it asked, its voice soft, almost coaxing, but there was something insidious about it. Something that made my skin crawl. I shook my head, unable to speak. My mind was a whirlwind of confusion, fear, and disbelief. What was this thing? What did it want from me? "You don't remember, do you?" The voice shifted, a faint whisper in my ear. "You never remember, but I do. I've always been here." The words hit me like a physical blow. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. My mind was blank, a void of terror. "What do you want from me?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely above a whisper, trembling with fear. The figure didn't answer immediately. It just stood there, staring at me with those hollow, empty eyes. Eyes that seemed to pierce through everything. Through the walls. Through time itself. "You know what I want," it said finally, its voice now deep, like the rumble of thunder in the distance. "I want you to remember." I staggered back, my mind racing, but no memories surfaced. I felt as though I was losing myself. The shadow had been with me for so long, following me through every step, every decision, every choice. But what was it? What had happened? "You can't outrun the past," it continued, its voice low and foreboding. "It always catches up to you. Always." Suddenly everything around me seemed to collapse inward. The walls closed in, the room shrinking, the air thick with dread. I felt my knees buckle, my legs giving way beneath me, and I collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. And then, as if it had never been there, the figure was gone. The room fell silent again. I was left alone, sitting on the floor, surrounded by the remnants of my shattered mind. But I knew it wasn't over. It never would be. The shadow was still there, lurking at the edge of my consciousness, waiting to consume me. I could still hear it whispering in the darkness. I never left. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like, but if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. I still remember the moment when I first noticed it. It started with a question I couldn't quite shake off. How far can you trust the people around you? I never expected that such a simple thought would unravel the threads of something much darker, something that was hidden right before my eyes. It was an ordinary evening, one of those gray afternoons that hang heavy in the air just before nightfall. The streetlights flickered to life, casting long, cold shadows that crept across the sidewalk. My apartment felt smaller, quieter than usual, a hollow stillness lingering in the air. It should have been comforting, but it was. There was something. Something that I couldn't quite place. I live in a small city, one where everyone knows everyone, or so I thought. At least that was the case until I started seeing things I couldn't explain. It all began when I noticed strange connections between people I thought I knew well. People in my circle, neighbors, colleagues, family, seemed to have shared histories, little coincidences that linked them in ways I hadn't expected. Some of them were easy to dismiss as small-town gossip or harmless coincidences, but as I dug deeper, the pieces of the puzzle started fitting together in ways that made my stomach twist. My mind was already unsettled, reeling from recent personal loss. A family tragedy had shaken me to the core, one I couldn't talk about, one I wasn't ready to face. But that evening, as I sat alone in my apartment, staring at the streetlights outside, I couldn't stop thinking about these connections. My thoughts were like a string of broken beads, scattered across my mind, barely hanging together. I felt the tension in my shoulders, the unease building in my chest. And then I heard it. A faint noise, just a rustling at first. It was so subtle that I thought I had imagined it, a mere trick of the wind brushing against the window. But no, it was there again. A soft, almost imperceptible movement, as if someone was shifting just outside my field of vision. I froze, not sure whether to move or stay still. I had to be imagining things. But the air in the room felt colder, the shadows darker. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was nothing. But the noise didn't stop. It grew louder, closer. I stood up, my legs shaking slightly as I moved towards the window, pressing my palm against the cool glass. The street outside was empty. But then there at the edge of my sight, something shifted in the darkness. A figure just beyond the reach of the light, standing perfectly still. I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest. No, it couldn't be. It was too dark to make out details, too fleeting to trust. But my pulse raced and a strange, gnawing fear twisted in my stomach. Was I being watched? I turned away from the window, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread that clung to me like a second skin. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me. But when I reached the kitchen, the smell hit me. Faint but unmistakable, something metallic, something wrong. I looked around the small room, my hands trembling as I reached for the light switch. The kitchen was as it always was. No sign of anything out of place. Yet the smell, it lingered. Suddenly I wasn't so sure. Could it have been from something in the apartment? Or was it something else? My mind raced. The more I tried to dismiss it, the more the feeling of unease spread through me. There were too many questions I didn't have answers to. The ties between people I knew seemed to stretch too far, too deep. And then there was this overwhelming sensation that I wasn't alone, that I was being drawn into something far bigger than I could understand. I walked toward the hallway, hoping that putting some distance between myself and the kitchen would calm me down. I tried to focus on something else, anything else. But then I heard it again, a soft scuffling sound like footsteps. Not from outside, but from inside the apartment. I stopped dead in my tracks. My breath caught in my throat, the hairs on my neck standing on end. I couldn't be imagining this. Could I? The footsteps weren't just random. They were rhythmic, deliberate. Someone was here. Someone who knew exactly where to step, how to move in the silence. The sound stopped. For a split second, the silence was deafening. And then just as suddenly, I heard a whisper. Barely audible, but distinct. I know what you're looking for. I spun around, my pulse skyrocketing. But the hallway was empty. The lights flickered. I wasn't alone. I wasn't sure what was worse, the idea that someone had been here, or the thought that they might still be here, watching me from the shadows. I stood frozen, heart pounding in my chest, the whisper echoing in my mind. I know what you're looking for. It was like an ice-cold hand brushing against the back of my neck, sending a shiver of fear down my spine. I wanted to scream, to shout, to call someone, anyone. But no words came. My throat felt tight, like I was choking on the very air around me. I tried to shake it off, to convince myself it was nothing more than my imagination running wild, a product of stress and sleepless nights. I glanced over my shoulder, checking the hallway again, but saw nothing. The lights flickered once more, casting eerie shadows on the walls, making the whole apartment feel like a maze of shifting darkness. I forced myself to walk toward the living room, each step heavier than the last. The floor creaked under my feet as I moved, and the shadows seemed to grow longer, twisting in ways that didn't make sense. The apartment, once familiar, was now unfamiliar, like a place I had only visited in my nightmares. I pulled my phone out of my pocket, hoping for some kind of grounding presence, a text, a call, anything to remind me of the world outside these walls. But the screen was blank, the signal weak. I tried again, tapping frantically, but the result was the same. No connection. It was as if the very air around me had become a barrier, cutting me off from everything. I sank onto the couch, staring at my hands as if I could find some answer in them. But the more I focused on my shaking fingers, the more I realized just how alone I was in this. The sound of my own breath felt louder than it should have been, like the room itself was amplifying the smallest noise, making everything feel magnified. There was no denying it anymore. Something was happening, something I couldn't explain. And I was starting to think that the people I had known, those around me, were not who I thought they were. The pieces that seemed like little coincidences before now felt like part of a larger puzzle. I ran through the names of people I'd met in recent months, neighbors, coworkers, distant relatives. Each one had strange connections to the others. A cousin who casually knew a former boss. An old friend who had once worked with a neighbor. A colleague who had studied at the same university as my aunt. The odd part was that these people didn't know each other personally. But there was something about them, something that seemed to link them all, some invisible thread that I couldn't grasp. A sudden, sharp knock at the door snapped me out of my thoughts, making me jump to my feet. I had been so absorbed in my own fear, I hadn't heard anyone approach. I took a hesitant step toward the door, my mind racing. Who could it be? I hadn't invited anyone over. The knock came again, louder this time, more urgent. I approached the door slowly, my hand reaching for the handle. My palms were sweaty, and my heartbeat had begun to echo in my ears. I peered through the peephole, but saw nothing. The hallway outside was empty, the faint glow of the streetlights casting an eerie haze through the small window next to the door. What was happening? I should have opened the door, checked. But the growing dread inside me kept me frozen. What if it was someone I didn't know? Someone who had been watching me all this time. Or worse, someone I did know, who was hiding something far worse than I could imagine. A soft breath, barely audible, reached my ears. I froze again. It wasn't from the hallway. It was coming from inside the apartment. I spun around, but there was nothing, no one there. Only the growing darkness. The door. It felt like it was mocking me. Just open it, it seemed to say. You're already too far in. There's no turning back now. I couldn't stop myself from opening it. My hand, seemingly of its own accord, twisted the knob. The door creaked as it swung open, revealing only the dim light of the hallway. No one was there. For a moment, I thought I had imagined the entire thing. Maybe I was just spiraling. Maybe the pressure of the situation was making me lose grip on reality. I closed the door quickly, locking it again, my hands shaking. My breath was ragged. Bogus. Think clearly, I told myself. But the quiet wasn't helping. I glanced toward the window again, half expecting to see that same shadow lurking in the corner of my vision. But there was nothing. Just the dark outline of the street outside, bathed in the dull light of the street lamps. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I needed answers. I needed to understand what was happening before it drove me mad. There had to be something. I grabbed my laptop from the coffee table, opening it with trembling hands. I typed in a few phrases into the search bar, desperate for something, anything, to give me clarity. Unexplained disappearances in small towns. People who vanish without a trace. The unknown ties that bind people. It felt wrong, like I wasn't supposed to know. But the more I read, the more I felt a chill creeping over me. Every story, every case had something in common. There were always strange connections between the people involved, people who, by all appearances, should have never crossed paths, yet their stories were linked in ways no one could explain. I scrolled through the search results, my heart hammering in my chest. When then I found it. An article about a string of disappearances from a town not far from mine. A pattern that had gone unnoticed at first, but when looked at closely, it revealed something disturbing. The people who had disappeared were all tied together by someone who had been in contact with each of them, someone whose name I recognized. It was one of my coworkers. My breath hitched as I stared at the name on the screen. It was impossible. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, but the name was still there, staring back at me, mocking my disbelief. Lena Kovalchuk. I knew her. She sat 2 desks away from me at work, always polite, always friendly, never drawing attention to herself. But here she was, tied to these disappearances, linked to something far more sinister than I could have ever imagined. I clicked on the article, heart pounding in my chest. It was a local news piece from a year ago. A string of disappearances in nearby towns. At first, they were written off as isolated incidents with no clear connections between the victims. But then, as investigators dug deeper, they began to notice something strange. Every person who had vanished had some sort of prior interaction with Lena. Some knew her from work, others from social events, but it was there, an undeniable pattern. She had been in contact with each of them in the days leading up to their disappearances. The more I read, the more the knot in my stomach tightened. They didn't know how she was involved, whether she was simply a witness or something more. But the fact that her name kept resurfacing in these cases made it impossible to ignore. And now here I was, sitting in my own apartment, feeling like I was on the brink of uncovering something that was meant to stay buried. I couldn't just sit here. I had to know more. I stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor as I grabbed my jacket. The apartment suddenly felt stifling, the walls pressing in on me. I had to get out. I needed to see her. I needed answers. My mind raced with possibilities, each darker than the last. I forced myself to slow down, to think clearly. There had to be a reason, a rational explanation for all of this. But the nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach told me that the deeper I dug, the closer I would come to something I wasn't ready for. I left my apartment, the cool night air hitting my face as I stepped out into the quiet street. The city, usually bustling at this hour, seemed deserted. The streetlights flickered, casting long, jagged shadows across the pavement. I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to shake off the growing sense of dread that clung to me. It was a short walk to the office, but every step felt like an eternity. My mind kept replaying the article over and over, as if I could will the answers to come to me, as if they were hidden in the details I'd already read. But the more I thought about Lena, the more questions piled up. What did she know? How was she involved in these disappearances? And why was I only just now connecting the dots? The office building loomed ahead, dark and empty. It was strange. There should have been at least a few lights on, some late-night workers finishing up their tasks. But everything was silent. I reached the entrance and pushed the door open, stepping into the quiet lobby. My footsteps echoed in the stillness, a reminder that I was alone in this place, alone in this search for answers. I knew Lena's desk by heart. I had sat beside her countless times, exchanging polite small talk about nothing in particular. But now, as I approached her desk, everything felt different. The soft hum of the fluorescent lights above me seemed louder than usual, the air heavier. I hesitated before sitting down at her chair, my fingers brushing over the cluttered surface. Papers, pens, a half-empty coffee cup, nothing out of the ordinary, at least at first glance. But as I dug through her things, flipping through papers in a frenzy, I found it. A small notebook tucked away under a pile of receipts. I pulled it out, my hands trembling as I flipped it open. Inside there were names, lists of names, scribbled in tight, frantic handwriting. Some were crossed out, some were circled. The ink was smudged in places, as though it had been written in a hurry. The names were familiar. People I had worked with. People I had seen at company events. Some were colleagues, others were acquaintances, even friends. And just like the article described, Lena had been in contact with each of them. My blood ran cold as I read the entries. One of the names was mine. I slammed the notebook shut, my heart racing in my chest. This couldn't be real. It had to be a mistake, some sort of coincidence. But as I sat there, staring at the desk in front of me, the pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. The disappearances. The connection. Lena. It wasn't just a strange coincidence. It was a pattern, something deliberate. And I was in the middle of it. A noise, a soft scrape against the floor, broke my train of thought. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Someone was here. I stood up quickly, heart pounding in my chest, but the lobby was empty. The only sound was the faint hum of the lights above. But I knew what I had heard. I wasn't alone. I stepped back toward the entrance, glancing nervously over my shoulder. The air was thick with the feeling that something was wrong, something that had been wrong for a long time. The door swung open behind me, the rush of cold air hitting my face like a slap. And then through the doorway, I saw her. Lena. She stood there just outside the entrance, her silhouette barely visible in the dim light. But there was something about her stance, something about the way she was standing there, unmoving, that sent a chill down my spine. I didn't know what to say. I couldn't speak. I could only stand there, my heart racing in my chest, as she took a slow, deliberate step toward me. I knew you'd come looking for answers, she said softly, her voice carrying an odd weight as though it was no longer just hers. And then, without another word, she stepped into the shadows. The words she spoke hit me like a physical blow. I knew you'd come looking for answers. The weight of her voice lingered in the air, heavy, oppressive. She was standing there just outside the entrance, her figure barely visible in the low light. But I felt something strange about the way she moved, or rather, didn't move. There was an unnatural stillness in her posture, as if she were waiting for me to react. I wanted to run. I wanted to turn around and bolt out the door, but my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by a mix of fear and confusion. The longer I stared at her, the more something inside me began to shift. It was as if the world had tilted, and what had once felt like a normal, albeit eerie, situation was now something completely different, something sinister. She's not herself. That was the first thought that ran through my mind. Lena's expression, or rather the lack of it, was wrong. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, distant, like she was no longer fully present. Her usual friendly demeanor was replaced by something colder, something that felt. "Thorin, why are you doing this?" I managed to croak, my voice barely audible. The words felt hollow in my mouth, as if they were part of some dream I couldn't wake up from. "What is happening? What do you want from me?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, as if considering my question, but the way she did it was off, unnatural, like something had twisted her body into a position it wasn't meant to be in. Her hands hung loosely at her sides, and I noticed, for the first time, how pale and cold they looked. "You've already seen too much," she finally replied, her voice almost a whisper, but somehow still cutting through the silence like a blade. "There's no turning back now." Her words sent a chill through me. I felt like I was being drawn into something much bigger than I had ever imagined. There were no more simple explanations. No more safe, rational reasons for what was happening. This wasn't just a coincidence. It wasn't just a string of strange events. No, this was something orchestrated, something deliberate. And I had become a part of it. I took a cautious step back, the floor creaking under my feet. The air around me seemed to grow thicker, heavier, suffocating me with every breath. I could feel my heart thudding in my chest, each beat reminding me that I was standing on the edge of something terrifying. My mind was racing, scrambling for any logical explanation, any way out. But there was none. Lena took a step toward me, her movements slow and deliberate. She was no longer just a coworker I'd known for years. She was something else entirely, something not human. The fear that had been gnawing at me since I first discovered those disappearances grew stronger, turning into a full-blown panic. I wanted to scream, to run, to escape, but I couldn't move. It was as though the space around me was closing in, and the walls were pressing tighter with each passing second. "You don't understand," she continued, her voice now softer, almost soothing. "You think it's just about you, about the others. But it's not. It's about all of us. All of us are connected. We always have been." I felt my stomach twist in confusion. Her words didn't make sense. How could she know all this? How could she be saying these things so casually, like it was all part of some grand plan I wasn't privy to? I took another step back, my hands trembling. "What do you mean? What are you talking about?" Lena smiled, but it wasn't a comforting smile. It was cold, calculating, as if she was enjoying the fear in my eyes. "You've already felt it, haven't you? The connections, the threads pulling at you, at everyone around you. You've been looking for answers, but you've always been looking in the wrong places." I could hear the sound of my breathing, quick and shallow, as I backed into the corner of the office. My eyes flicked to the door. Escape. But I knew deep down that it wouldn't matter. Even if I managed to get out of here, it wouldn't stop the thing inside of her from following me. I glanced at the notebook I'd found earlier, the one with the names, the list of people connected to Lena. And my name was there, too. I knew it was. I had seen it clearly in the chaotic scribbles on the page. I had been searching for meaning in those names, thinking they were random, unrelated. But now it was all becoming clear. This wasn't random. It wasn't a coincidence. I was part of this. Why me? I whispered, my voice barely more than a breath. Why are you doing this to me? Lena's expression softened for just a moment, like a flicker of humanity behind her otherwise empty gaze. But then it was gone, replaced by something colder. Because you're already part of it. You've been a part of it for a long time. You just didn't know it. But you will. In time, you'll understand. And you'll see the truth. Her words echoed in my mind, and I tried to push them away. It didn't make sense. This can't be real. But as I looked at Lena standing there, her face expressionless, her body unnatural, I knew deep down that it was. Whatever was happening to me, to everyone, was far beyond anything I could have imagined. She took another step forward, and this time I couldn't stop myself from retreating further into the corner. The walls were too close now, closing in around me. I felt trapped, cornered. There was nowhere to run. You've been chasing ghosts, she continued, her voice almost playful now, as if she were enjoying my fear. But the real ghosts aren't the ones you think they are. The real ones are the ones who have been with you all along. The ones who have always been watching, waiting for you to see. I could hear her breathing, shallow and uneven, as if her own words were an effort. She was no longer human, I realized. Not in the way I had thought. Whatever she had become, whatever she was a part of, it was beyond anything I could comprehend. Then, as quickly as she had appeared, she stepped back, disappearing into the shadows once more. The silence that followed was deafening, the absence of her presence now more unsettling than anything else. I stood there for what felt like hours, my body frozen, my mind in a state of chaos. My chest tightened, my thoughts spinning in endless loops, and I couldn't escape them. The connection, Lena, and the truth. The pieces were scattered, and I was only beginning to understand the puzzle. But I knew one thing for sure. Whatever was happening, whatever Lena was part of, it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I wasn't going to be able to escape it. Not anymore. I couldn't breathe. The air felt thicker now, heavier. It pressed against my chest, made every inhale feel like a struggle. My mind spun, trying to make sense of everything that had just happened. Lena had vanished into the shadows, leaving me standing there in the silence of the office, my thoughts a chaotic mess. What just happened? I could still hear her voice in my head, those haunting words echoing like a mantra. You're already part of it, the connection. The truth. I could feel it gnawing at me, pulling me in. But what did it mean? What was this truth that she spoke of? And why was I caught in the middle of it? I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a chair as I tried to regain some semblance of control. My mind raced. Should I leave? Should I call someone? Should I warn people about Lena, about whatever this was? But then I remembered the names in the notebook, the names she had kept, the people who had disappeared, the ones I knew. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was bigger than just Lena. This was about all of us, everyone I knew, everyone I interacted with. The connections were deeper, older than I could comprehend. And now I was tangled in them. I couldn't sit there and wonder. I had to know more. I had to understand what was happening, or I would lose my mind to the uncertainty. I grabbed the notebook, shaking hands, clutching it tightly. The names had been written with urgency, desperation. Some were underlined, others crossed out. There was a sense of order to it, but also a chaotic energy that sent shivers down my spine. I flipped through the pages again, my fingers brushing over each name. And then I saw it, the final entry, almost hidden among the other scribbles, the last name on the list. Mine. It was there, plain as day. My name. And next to it a series of strange symbols, almost like a code. A pattern that didn't make sense at first glance, but something about it made my stomach turn. I felt like I was missing something crucial, something that could make all the pieces fit together. I ran my fingers across the paper, feeling the ridges of the ink, as if hoping the answers would somehow reveal themselves. But nothing came to me. I only felt more lost. I glanced around the office again. The once familiar space now felt like a trap. It had been twisted, turned into something darker. The hum of the lights above me was deafening now, and the shadows stretched across the room like dark fingers pulling me in. The walls seemed to close in tighter, the air growing colder with each passing second. I needed to get out of there, needed to clear my head. But I couldn't leave. Not yet. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a precipice, and if I walked away now, I might never find my way back. I had to confront this. I had to understand why all of this was happening. I grabbed my coat from the back of the chair, slipping it on, the cold fabric pressing against my skin. The office building felt unnervingly empty. No lights in the hallways, no sounds of footsteps echoing. It was as if everyone had vanished. As if I were the only one left. I walked through the empty hall, my footsteps reverberating off the walls. The silence was oppressive, wrapping around me, making it harder to think. There was a weight to this place now, something suffocating. I reached the door to the stairwell, but as I touched the handle, a sharp, sudden click echoed through the building, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. I froze, heart hammering in my chest. I didn't need to turn around to know it was her. It had to be. Lena. I didn't look back. I couldn't. If I did, I knew I would be consumed by the fear, the dread that was already threatening to swallow me whole. But I knew she was there. I could feel her presence, cold and unrelenting, like a shadow that would never leave. I gripped the door handle tighter, my knuckles turning white. I could almost hear the slow, measured steps of her approach, the sound of her breathing, unnaturally quiet, like she was trying not to be heard. But I knew she was behind me, waiting. My hand hovered over the door as the footsteps drew closer. I had to move. I couldn't stand here any longer, not with her so close. I wrenched the door open and darted down the stairs, not looking back, not daring to glance over my shoulder. The stairwell was dark, the air thick with the scent of dust and old wood. My footsteps echoed louder than ever in the silence, a constant reminder that I was being followed, hunted. I could feel her closing in, her presence growing stronger, more suffocating. I pushed myself harder, faster, desperate to put distance between us, but it didn't matter. No matter how fast I ran, no matter how many corners I turned, the feeling that she was just behind me never left. I burst through the door at the bottom of the stairwell, and into the dimly lit hallway of the building's ground floor. It was eerily quiet, the hum of the fluorescent lights above the only sound. But then I heard it again, those footsteps. I didn't dare look back. I couldn't afford to. Instead, I pushed forward, my breath ragged, my legs burning from the effort. The exit was just ahead. But before I could reach it, something stopped me. A figure stood in the doorway, blocking my way. Lena. Her silhouette loomed in the dark, her face obscured by shadows, but her eyes, they were the only thing I could see. They were wide, unblinking, filled with an emptiness that made my blood run cold. "You can't run from this," she said, her voice barely a whisper, but it cut through the silence like a knife. "You're already a part of it. We all are." I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. My heart hammered in my chest, the panic rising in my chest like an uncontrollable fire. "You don't have a choice," Lena continued, her voice softening as if she were speaking to a frightened child. "You'll understand soon enough. Just wait." The world around me spun, everything blurring together. I was caught in a nightmare, and there was no waking up. I tried to speak, to demand answers, but my voice betrayed me. All I could do was stand there, frozen in terror, as Lena took a step closer, her figure filling the doorway, her presence all-consuming. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch toward her, as if they were part of her, merging with her in the darkness. And then, without another word, she reached out, her cold hand brushing against my arm, sending a jolt of ice through my veins. "Everything is connected," she whispered, and the world went black. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.